Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to another live event on our channel. My name is Edith, and as you can see, no chattering teacup is keeping me company today. She is a little bit under the weather, but she sends her regards. And you are in for a treat, dear listeners. As you have seen on our posters, we have two wonderful guests who are going to join me shortly for this live event, Science in Fiction. And here they are. Hello and welcome. Caroline and C.A. Farlow. Ladies, you are returning guests to our show. C.A., you are a regular. It is true, isn't it? You have been on our show more than once. Caroline has been also here before. And the title is perfect. Let's be honest here. Science in Fiction. Both of you have written science in your books. CA, you have written the Nexus series and you have written the Paris Contagion, and the new one is coming up also very soon. And Caroline, you have also included a lot of science in your books or in your book. The next one is coming up.
I do have two.
Okay.
I do have two books published.
Okay. Sorry about that. And I will hand over the screen to you. Let's start with you, CA. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
So I spent 20 years in international petroleum exploration, traveled the world, luckily. I think you have to have a perspective for a lot of things these days. I have a scientific background in tectonics and earthquake mechanics, which may or may not enter into my books, but science definitely enters in. I think you have to be a curious science person and learn as you go. So science is critically important to that.
Okay, Caroline, you also have a background in science. What can you tell us about your background before we dive right into the questions of science in fiction?
Well, I've always been a science geek, basically, and for a long time that's kind of all it was. And then I went to college and studied a lot of environmental science in the undergrad, but and then went on to get a master's degree in conservation biology. Uh, I haven't actually worked as a scientist, other than my master's thesis. I haven't done that kind of research, but I'm a full-time writer, and a lot of my work is science related in one way or another, whether that's, writing content for people's websites or my fiction, or I also have a blog on climate change that's uh, like 13 years old now. It's I've been doing it for a while. Uh, and science is also a big part of my philosophy about how I approach fiction. I might get into that a little bit more, explaining what that means later. But, it's mostly ecology, conservation issues, environmental science. I like botany. Botany's cool.
Okay, the first question to the both of you would be, what is science? How would you describe science? And what is twofold the question? And what does including science in fiction mean to you? Let's start with you, Caroline.
Okay. Well, I could provide a technical, this is science definition, but basically it's keeping track of what you know versus what you don't know. People think I think sometimes that science is technobabble or, you know, cool technology or weird tricks with chemistry or whatever, and that's not it. I mean, you need science to have all of those things, but those things are not science. What science is remembering that if you don't have evidence to support an idea, you don't know. Real scientists get very good at saying, I don't know. You know? um, and so then what is science and fiction? It sounds kind of weird because if the essence of science is don't just make stuff up, and the essence of fiction is you make stuff up, like how do they go together? But the thing is, if you're going to writing fiction based in science means keeping track of what you know versus what you don't know, what's possible versus what's not possible. So if you want to throw in something made up, fine. If you want to throw in something completely fantastical, like giant flying dragons or whatever, that's cool. But don't do it just because you're lazy. Like, well, I had to make this stuff up in order to make it a better story. No, do you know how many cool stories there are out there in actual reality? There's just no end to it. Uh,
Yeah.
so be clear about what's real, what's not real. And when you make stuff up, do it on purpose, do it boldly, do it obviously, do it deliberately, not just because, you can't think of something.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it's about for me.
Mm-hmm. CA, what about you?
I think if we look at scientists back all the way to the ancient Egyptians or the Babylonians or, where the basis of mathematics began, the individuals who did it are naturally curious about the world around them, and they want to explain the world around them in some way, shape, or form. And it's based in observation, and then from that they say, I wonder why. And from why, they develop a hypothesis, and then they go out and they test their hypotheses. And early on, it was against other observations, as the world flat. Well, can we see what's beyond the horizon? Not really. Um, Everything all the way up to thought experiments, either like Schrodinger's cat in a box experiment. They couldn't necessarily do experimentation to determine if what they were observing is correct or what they hypothesized is correct. So they went ahead and said, can we create a construct and test the idea that way? So if you think about the theory of relativity, Einstein listened to a train coming into a and how the sound of the train changed. And then when the train left the station, how the sound of the train changed from there. So that's a thought experiment. When he was very young, he thought about riding on a light beam. What would that be like to ride across space on a light beam? So thought experiments are a good way to test that hypothesis. Then if you start getting data back, like originally Einstein hypothesized that gravitational waves would exist, but he had no way to know if they existed or not because experimentally they couldn't prove it. And then now we have LIGO, and LIGO actually can measure gravitational waves that impact the Earth. And so we now know that gravitation have gone from a hypothesis to a theory. And that's sort of science. It's building on the foundation of what came before through observation of the natural world around you, and then stretching your imagination out into the future. As far as science and fiction goes, my feeling is you can't have science and fiction unless you start with science fact. And you have to prove the science fact in the book, and then you start pushing the science fiction out there. So if you want to use wormholes in your book, that's a way to travel instantaneously from one point in the universe to the next. You better start with Einstein-Rosen bridges because those are mini wormholes that are a part of general relativity. So start with the basis, science fact and then build on that into your science fiction.
Okay. Sorry to be annoying for our listeners here. Do you have by any chance headphones at hand? Because I still
Are
get,
we echoing?
yeah, it sounds a bit strange. Maybe your speakers are a bit too loud. I don't know. Um, make it.
Give me a moment.
Yeah. Don't you worry. We shall make it perfect for our listeners. Okay. That ties in what you said, what both of you said, ties in a little bit with what.
If I can untangle them.
Yeah, yeah, echoey, I think now. Perfect. Oh, that's the fun of live streaming. Yeah. Huh.
There we go. Is
There
that
we.
better?
Yeah, definitely, most definitely. Thank you. Sorry to
You're
be
welcome.
annoying.
That's okay.
Sorry to be annoying. Now it sounds absolutely perfect. And now that you've talked about what science is and what it means, what would you say is your approach to science in fiction? Now let's start with UCA. What is your approach to incorporating science in your fiction?
It's interesting because science is what drives my fiction. So I will have, will have read an article about some such thing in science, and I'll think, whoa, well, that could be this or that could be something else. And it drives the basis my for my fiction. So in the nexus theory, parallel realities are really important. Multiverse theory, string theory all come into play, as well as faster than light travel. So those things all push the science into the fiction. And then the fiction drove, or the science drove the fiction to a certain extent. In the Paris Contagion, which is a political thriller, it has a lot of medical science in it. I read a lot about hemorrhagic fevers. And then I read Walter Isaacson's The Code Breakers, which was about CRISPR and gene editing. And I went, whoa, what happens if gene editing gets into the hands of not so ethical individuals or rogue governments or terrorists? How easy is it to use that? And from there sprang the Paris Contagion. So I won't say too much more. I'll give it all away, right? So my fiction is actually based in the science, and the science definitely comes first. So the next book coming out in the Nexus series is called Quantum Time. And I've got to use some of Einstein's theories on time travel and the ability to move my characters along a time spectrum. And in general relativity, time is not constant. Time is actually relative. So I can actually bend time using general relativity. So that's kind of the basis of, but yet my characters are going to get drug along in time travel in that book. So
And all without a TARDIS.
and
Do
all without a TARDIS. That's exactly right. I'd love to use a TARDIS, but what the heck is a TARDIS anyway? I mean, that's out there on the edge. This is versus hard science fiction, as people
ex-
call it.
yeah, exactly. But wouldn't we all love to have one? I mean, bigger on the inside.
Yeah, just walk in the closet door and be gone.
Exactly. Now, Caroline, what about your approach to science in your fiction?
Well, I guess the best way to answer the question is to give examples. Uh, so my first book, I wanted to write about Australopithecines. So basically the most ape-like of our ancestors that was bipedal and, so on and so forth. I wanted to write about them. And that's been done before. I mean, people have, the first chapter in 2001. That's been done. But I wanted to make it realistic. So I read a lot about the behavior of modern apes. I read a lot about human behavior, looking into how do people in different cultures act, because I don't want to just assume that my own culture is all of humanity. How much can we actually vary as humans, and why do we do the things we do? And how the bodies of these animals actually worked. What were they like physically? What could they do? What would it be like to be them physically? Like, for example, they didn't have the endurance that we do with walking and running. So then that shapes certain scenes and how the characters have to act, because I know about their hip structure. Um, and it took me years to do that because I wanted to get it right, because it's more fun that way. and uh, what's the point about writing about a real extinct species if you don't bother to find out about what it was like and how it lived and what the world was like then? So I did all of that. And that was before I went to college. So I sort of had to make up how to do research on my own. And there were a lot of wrong turns. And eventually I figured it out. Um, with my second book, Ecological Memory, I didn't need to do much research for that because I basically took everything I learned in grad school and poured it into a book. Uh, but it's set in the relatively near future, uh, after our civilization ends and a new one begins. And so I needed to know, this society that I wanted to write about, they don't use fossil fuels. So what would that be like? What would technology look like if you didn't have access to that kind of energy? And that requires understanding the second law of thermodynamics. Uh, and I'm happy to babble about what that means if you're interested, but I don't have to. But it I needed to understand what that was and how that was related, and I needed to know what might climate change do between now and then. The book is set in New England, so what's New England actually going to be like in a couple of decades? Um, the thing that ends civilization in my story, and I mean, you find out this out very quickly, it's not really a spoiler, is a uh, virus that might be genetically modified, that's never really made clear. And this is global pandemic. I wrote this before COVID happened, by the way. So I had to read up on how do pandemics work and how do viruses work. I actually talked to somebody who's a virology student, and I picked his brain for a while, and finding out how this worked, because I didn't want virologists to read my book and start twitching. I wanted to respect their expertise as readers and have it be believable for them. Um, then I'm about to come out with another one now that's in the same world. It's just, some years later, and that's relying on the same kind of thing. And I've started writing one after that that's going to be in a completely, it's not in the same series. And that is going to involve, I have to read up on primeval forests and forest ecology, because that's going to be very important for that. And that's going to be very important for the character. So basically, I do a whole bunch of research for my books because I want to get it right, because I want to write about what I'm writing about. I don't want to write about my, uneducated version of it. I want to find out what it's really about so that I can write about it and I get it right. And I also, there's so many awesome stories out there. You know, like trees talk to each other. I mean, they don't use language, but they communicate with each other. And
Mhm.
isn't that awesome?
Yep.
And wouldn't it be cool to write a story where that matters? No. So that's where I'm coming from with that.
Mm. And how would you say did your area of expertise, especially influence or shape your writing, Caroline?
Well, before it was an area of expertise, it was a personal interest. You know, I've always liked science. So that's what I write about. I mean, not exclusively, but I write what I'm interested in. So that's why I ended up writing about the Australopithecines, even though that I didn't know anything about them when I started out. I hadn't been to college. I wasn't at all an expert, but I wanted to write about that because I had the interest. So then I developed enough expertise to write about them credibly. Uh, yeah, I went to grad school fundamentally because I was really interested in ecology. I get excited about it. It makes me happy. So then that's what I wrote about. You know, I mean, I'm not interested in uh, spies. So I don't write about spies. I'm not interested in football. I don't write about football. I am interested in science, so I write about science. So it's not
Mhm.
really like my expertise influenced my writing. It's that my interest produced the expertise and also produced the writing. Now, having written a book without really knowing very much to start out with, and having written a book after going to grad school, I can say the latter is easier. Uh, you know, having some expertise makes writing about what I'm interested in a lot easier. It gives me a leg up.
Mm. What about you, CA? How did your area of expertise influence or shape your writing?
I think it is my writing. I've always said to all of my editors and to my two publishers, three publishers now, that I'm a scientist. I know nothing about English and grammar and spelling and et cetera, et cetera. And I'll get it down. I'll write from what I know and my experiences in science and my understanding of science, how research is done, what the basic principles are. It influences my plots and therefore my characters. And my characters, for the most part, in all of my books, there are hard scientists in all my books as characters. They are either the primary character or they are ancillary characters who are critical to move the science along. So you've got somebody who's already an expert in the book who can explain the science that's the basis, and then you're going to take the science and I'm going to shove it forward as far as you can without going too far because it becomes at some point it becomes arm wavium. You know, it's not believable to the point that somebody is going to put it down and say, nah, that's not real. I don't buy it, and not finish the book. And that's not good either. But I think you have to respect your readers and make sure you're strong enough that your editors aren't going to say there's too much science in the book. And you have to say, no, the science is critically important to the book. And then get good reviews back from people who read it to say, thank you for not dumbing down the science and treating us all like sixth graders. So that's critically important. But I don't think you can get too far afield from what you know because otherwise your fiction is going to be kind of out there without a framework of factual or foundations. So,
Mm. And that brings me to the next question. You mentioned editors and your readership. So, mm, the need for editors to not underestimate the readers and to understand the level of science that is presented. How important is that? That you twofold. I mean, not underestimate, like you said, your reader, not dumping down, toning down the science, and treating them like you said, uh, I don't know, people in kindergarten, And also for those who edit your books, their
Mhm.
understanding or the understanding of the author and their need uh, for science, CA.
Well, I think it's evolved. My first editor of my very first book wa freaked out over the science. Absolutely. Couldn't handle the science, didn't want the science in there, even though she was also a science fiction writer. And I think that's where you have to get into the definition between what kind of science fiction are you writing? Are you writing hard science fiction, which you have to be a scientist to do that, which will probably off-put certain readers? Are you writing science that verges into fantasy, which is where some of my books have gone over time? Or are you writing science as ancillary to the plot? It's still called science fiction, but it really becomes social science or cultural development science. And I'll give you an example. I would say that my Nexus series is verging on hard science fiction with a bit of fantasy, whereas Catherine Forrest's trilogy, the Daughters of the Coral Dawn trilogy, science is important. Obviously, there's time travel and space travel in it, but it's not a basis for the plot. The plot is about social science, about women in Earth's environment and Earth's culture, and women in an all women society. So you have to kind of I write as a hard scientist, and that's what comes across in my book. So to get an editor to match is really important. And when I wrote The Paris Contagion, my first publisher said, "No, we don't want to publish this book." And then I went out and found, military people. I found editors who were asked to go in and edit just content, not put the comma in the right place or the semicolon in the right place. And that was critically important to make it real. So, having not been in the military, um, a Navy individual or a Navy veteran could pick up the book and say, "I understand this. It's right. The military stuff is correct." Um, but I really think that all of those books have place, and it's important that you hold the fort, so to say, and say, "No, you can't take science out of my book." So by the time I got now 4 books published, it's a matter of, "Oh, she's gonna write a science fiction book that has hard science in it. Let's get her an editor that can spell science," you know? And I think that that's kind of where it's evolved to, a a debuting author versus an author who has a published history. So that's I think the editor match is really important, and I think you have to have a publisher who will respect where the book is coming from. And I think my publisher, the one who published The Paris Contagion, who balked at it and said, "Well, you were under contract from before, so we have to publish this," has now learned that publishing is um, it's going to be okay for them. They're going to make money. So
Good for them and good for you.
yeah, good for them.
Caroline, what about you? What about your take on editors and their importance for publishing books with a lot of science in them?
Editors are important just generally. Um, now, I I will get my content checked out sometimes as needed. There's a passage in my in the the next book that I'm going to come out with that involves a forest fire. My husband happens to be a wildlands firefighter, so I asked him to read it. Is this right? And he said it was. So I definitely do that. Um, as for developmental editing, putting the comma in the right place, that sort of thing. Um, I write for I write for a general reader. You don't have to have a science background in order to understand my books. You just have to like science. So I don't need an editor who has a science background. I do need an editor who remembers whose book it is. It's not your book. editor. It's my book. So your job is to help me make my book better, not to make my book become the book that you would write if you were writing a book. And that's true of all editors, no matter what your book is about. It's uh, an editor who can't do that needs to find another line of work,
Yeah.
in my opinion. Now, as to, I have had people tell me, your book is too sciency. Your title is too sciency. Whatever. I mean, is somebody who doesn't like science gonna like my books? Maybe, but probably not. Maybe I'll convert them. Maybe not. But that's fine.
Oh,
Where I go with it is, okay, let's put, instead of science, let's put American football, Oh, we can't call it Monday Night Football. That sounds too football-y. It'll turn off the geeks. Well, that just sounds stupid. So
oh, she froze a little bit. It's the.
science is, because I'm writing for people who like science.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah, I'm with you on the
yeah,
American football. Maybe that's the European in me. I don't know. I'm not so fond of
Well,
American football either.
but but Sunday morning's football is in Frankfurt, so this Sunday. So
Yeah, I
I
know,
mean,
but the Rugby World Cup just finished, so I'm more the rugby
yeah,
kind of person.
real football.
Exactly, real man.
Yeah.
Come to think of it.
Mhm.
Okay, uh, absolutely understand your take on editors and what the job should be. And what about scientists themselves? I thought about the question that should scientists read fiction to become better promoters of science themselves? Hmm.
not
Who would like to
especially.
start? Caroline.
Uh, I mean, of course, all scientists should read fiction, and that they should read my books. Everybody should read my books. But
Hmm?
I mean, aside from that, if you don't like reading fiction, don't read fiction. Reading fiction doesn't mean you can write fiction. There's a lot of people who can read fiction very well who can't write. And writing fiction, I mean, that's one way to do science communication. It's not the only way. You can do it some other way. And frankly, if a scientist doesn't want to do science communication, if all they want to do is their research and publish in scientific journals and all of that, that's fine. Somebody else can do the science education. Me, for example, you hire me to do science education, is fine. And if you don't want to read fiction, you don't have to read fiction. That's a, that's the way
I
I think
I
about it.
I think you have to have. I think scientists in general have to do anything to stretch their imagination. And I had a geology professor once say, you know, the geology student or the geologist who has seen the most rocks in the end wins. Because geology is one of those sciences that's a mixture of lots of hard science, chemistry, physics, all kinds of things. But on the other hand, it's observational, it's an art form. It's, wait, I saw a rock 10 years ago in this environment that looks kind of like the one I'm looking at now. So is this also a delta preserved in the rock record? Or, is this something formed by a landslide in the past? So that's kind of the way I look at scientists. I mean, you'll do better science, whether it's theoretical science and you're sitting in a lab in Princeton thinking about Einstein's thoughts, or are you sitting, in the field in the Himalayas and thinking about thrust faulting? Either way, anything that expands your horizon, anything that allows you to say, "Hey, I think I saw that before," or "This looks like that." That's all about science. So imagination is kind of the first thing to observation, to then take it all the way to scientific law. I think it's critically important. I don't know if you do that by reading fiction or you do that by doing more research or talking to people. There's all kinds of ways to do it, but I think you have to expose yourself to a lot of different things.
Mm. And coming back to what Caroline said, one of our listeners or people who watch Terry on Facebook said, you cannot write to everyone. If you love to write sciencey books, then you should write it. I fully agree. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
You can't
Yeah.
please everyone. It's simply not done. That's what it
Right.
is. And
Right.
I enjoy books where there's lots of science in it. You know that, CA, because I said don't
Mhm.
tone it down. And my question would be, how much science in a book of fiction is enough and not too much? You touched a little bit upon that, CA. Where is the line uh, when it becomes too much or when it's not enough? CA, what's your take?
So if so with me, if I have a scientific theory or something that I want to put out there to say this is sort of the science plot theme for the book, then that's kind of where I start. But it always starts in science fact or science theory, and then I'll take that and use the science theory to say how can I make my spaceships go faster than light, which the speed of light is supposedly a hard foundation that you can't surpass. But yet, if you think about gravitational waves and the energy within those gravitational waves, if you could, if you will, surf on the wave and then gather the gravitational energy that's within the gravitational wave and concentrate it, can you make your ship go faster than the speed of light, which is what the speed at which the gravitational waves travel. So I think you have to start with a scientific foundation that's based in fact in the book, and then push it out as, if you will, tools that your characters are going to use to push the plot forward. Um, and I'm one of those people, I don't outline my books. I don't do a whole bunch of, I have my scientific theory that I'm going to use. I have a couple of characters that I know where I want them to go, and then we just go. And I know that's, maybe we'll have a page of notes. And I know that's not the way it's supposed to be done, but as one of your listeners said, let's just write science. Let's write science fiction, and off you go. And that's why I'm stuck in the middle of the book I'm stuck now, because my characters want to go one way and I don't want them to go there. So
It happens, even without the
it
science,
happens.
believe me.
Yep.
Car- Sorry, Caroline, what about you? What is your opinion on too much or not enough science?
Well, see, I warned you that I might at some point say that's the wrong question. And here it is. uh, because how much science is enough? 3 pounds or kilograms, whatever. Uh, you can't really, science isn't a thing that there can be much of or little of. Ironically, you can't measure science. Uh,
True.
a book is either science based or it isn't.
Hmm.
It either keeps track of what's possible and not, uh, or it doesn't. Uh, I prefer those that do, both as a writer and as a reader. There are people who don't have a different preference. Um, Now, it is possible to talk about how much specialized jargon you're going to use, or how much of the book you're going to devote to explaining a theory or explaining, interesting facts that the reader might not know and needs to know to. Um, and those are important considerations. And I mean, it's definitely possible to spend too much time info dumping, too much time just having your characters be talking heads. I mean, you have to be careful with that. but the line is going to be different for different books, and it's going to be different how you handle it. You can have a lot of characters talking about science, and it works if you do it right. If you don't, well, then it doesn't work. Uh, so that varies a lot.
Mm. I mean, again, something our listeners said here on Facebook, compared to scientific facts and historical fact. I mean, give enough for the readers what they need, but not so much that they feel as if they are drowning in a textbook. I mean, you do not have to explain every historic little tidbit. I suppose it's the same with science like biology or physics or chemistry. Not each and every little tidbit is necessary. Otherwise, it might get too much. Maybe. I
Well,
don't know.
I, it can, and it can get overwhelming. And I do agree with Caroline that if you aren't careful, you can turn it into a nerd fest, right? And you don't want a nerd fest in your book necessarily, unless that's important. And I always, I always assume, rightly or incorrectly, that my readers have a certain basic understanding of what that science principle is, or they've heard of it, or they've heard about it. They've heard about CRISPR. They know about pandemics. We've just lived through one, those kind of things. But on the other hand, what I do with my readers is at the end of the book, I just stick, if you want to learn more about XYZ, here's a list of books or articles that you can actually go and, nerd yourself out on this list of books that I think are relevant to, the plot or the science that's within the book. So I don't necessarily have to overwhelm you within the context of the book itself. But if you're interested, go here. I don't want to leave you hanging, nor do I want you to have to be, you know, totally Google. Although Google can be your friend a lot of times when you're in the middle of, oh, wait, did I do that right? How do I explain Schrodinger's cat in a box when it's important for, uncertainty theory or whatever? I'm not going to go in and tell you it's about electron spin and it's about, uncertainty, and electrons don't really exist, but they only are in a field of probability. That's like, whoa, Conehead, this is way too much. But I can explain it with Schrodinger's cat in a box of a steady state of, before you open the box, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, because you just don't know until you observe it, and then you do. So I mean, that's kind of how I approach it. And then if they want to read more about it, there's a list in the back.
Caroline?
What's wrong with a nerd fest? I mean, arguably, I'm a nerd. I want a fest. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, if you don't want a nerd fest, if you don't want a nerd fest, if you do want a nerd fest, and have a nerd fest, but have it be a good nerd fest.
Yeah.
Uh, have it be a well-written nerd fest.
Yep.
Well, and you can do it with, have the characters in your book who are already nerds and everybody knows about it as they're reading the book, have them nerd out together, and everybody else can stand around and going, oh God, here they go again. It's like, and in fact, I think I've done that like 3 or 4 times in my books, of where
Nice.
I've had other characters go, oh, and you can see the characters rolling their eyes because the other two are off on this nerd tangent. But it's important, and I agree. I mean, I'd make the whole book a nerd fest if I could, but I think my publisher would be upset. So to tone it down a little bit.
Interesting what both of you said. Now I have a question from the teacup. Again, she sends her regards. If someone writes a book that is not based in our reality, be it fantasy, sci-fi, or an alternate reality, would it be okay for the author to put scientific facts that are true in this other world, but not in our world there? They might contradict our science, but not the science in the fictitious world.
Who goes first?
That's a real dive right in. That's a really, really good question because if the other world is not within our universe, then I would think you could apply any rules of science you wanted at that point. However, if you are if they're another world but it's in our same thing, then you have to um, apply whatever the universe. Some science is universal. The speed of light, for instance, how are you going to get past it? Um, the weight of uranium and the mass of uranium, those kind of things. So then you have to sort of stick to those, but you can push the principles out, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Caroline, what
It's a
about you?
science it's a science fiction question.
Yeah.
I have people being noisy. I
Oh, don't
hope you
worry.
can't hear it.
Yeah.
Anyway, uh, I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a scientific fact. I mean, there are facts, and science concerns itself with facts. But is there a non-scientific fact? I don't really think that there is. Yeah, if something is true in our context and it's not true in the context in which the book is set, if of course that's allowed. Whether it's not true, you know, I mean, in my first book, Australopithecines were still alive. They're not now. Does that mean I'm not allowed to write about Australopithecines because they're not alive now? Of course not. On the other hand, I mean, I have a blog that consists of my rewritten version of The Wizard of Oz. It's, fan fiction on my part. And there's all kinds of fantasy stuff in there. Like, talking scarecrows. Well, that works in Oz. Uh, of course, there's a whole bunch of, science stuff in there too, because I wrote it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, you make the rules. You can make the rules. But once you've made the rules, you need to follow the rules.
Hmm.
That's right. Yep,
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, world building, that's what they do in fantasy, don't they?
Right.
Make up the rules and then, like you said, you have to follow them. And another question from me. Do you think, I mean, again, you've touched a little bit on that, but more in general, do you think that publishers tend to underestimate their readers?
I don't, because if a publisher insists on writing a book that's dumbed down more than I want to read, I'm not that publisher's reader. So they're not underestimating me because I'm not their reader. Now, it may be that publishers are um, leaving money on the table because they're not publishing books that certain people would prefer. That's
Mm-hmm,
possible.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. CA, what is your take?
Um, I think the writer has to be careful in choosing their publisher, and one needs to look at what does the publisher actually publish. Do they do rom-coms? Do they do romance? Do they do lesbian fiction only? Do et cetera, et cetera? And if that's the case, and you're not writing a rom-com, then perhaps you should take your book elsewhere, and find a better fit. And then the editors would be more understanding, and it would all trickle down from there.
Mm,
Um, I I think that, um, and then of course there's the whole who needs a publisher. I mean, do we need publishers anymore? I mean, you can be your own publisher and do pretty well at it, I think. But I think there has to be a certain tie. I mean, if you're in the big houses, then they're going to have a branch that does science fiction or fantasy or
mm,
whatever, and they're going to stick your book over there and you're going to be fine, and the resources are greater and all that. But if your publisher only wants to publish romance and not poetry, then and you're writing poetry, you need to go somewhere else.
mm. Yeah, true. Absolutely. And a question again from the teacup. completely for you as readers. Does it annoy you as a reader when you read a story when there is science in it, but it is mostly glossed over and not explained properly? CA, does it annoy you?
Um, so right now I'm listening to the third book in a trilogy by Wagers. Um, and it's about Earth reality, Earth humans. However, it's after what they call the collapse. And the collapse is basically where we are now on Earth. In essence, the planet is dying and it's going to reach a critical point of unable to sustain itself anymore. And humans, 70 years into the future, actually are able to leave Earth and go out and explore for other habitable planets. Um, and it's really well written. I have to say, I'm really intrigued. I mean, I've listened to now 30 hours of the books, so I guess I'm into it. But when she goes from her current reality, which is 300 years in the future, and humans are out in space living on other planets, but comes back to Earth, she gets some of the environmental science stuff wrong. And she gets some of the meteorology and the earth science incorrect. And I sort of stumble over that and go, well, it's not key to the book, so I'm going to move on at that point. But it does give me pause at that point. And I think if I had been reading this in hard copy rather than listening to it, I might have put the book down
Mm,
at that point in time.
mm.
So,
Caroline,
and
what
she's
about?
published.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No,
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 and she's published by a big house. So I would think that their proofreaders would have sort of caught that. But maybe I'm too much of a science nerd and I'm looking at it as too in depth of an issue.
what about you, Caroline? Does it annoy you?
You asked whether it not being explained enough annoys me, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if not getting into the deep explanation fits the story, that's fine. I'm glad whatever it is gets mentioned. That's cool. Explaining it wrong really bothers me. Getting it
Yeah.
wrong really
Yeah.
bothers me. Um, Now, sometimes it's just funny. Like I'm a big Trekkie. I realize this isn't necessarily reading, but I mean, TV shows and movies were written before they were filmed.
Yeah.
They
Yep.
start out as writing, and I mean, Star Trek 4. It's a great movie, The Voyage Home, and the entire thing is based on an object making noise in a vacuum. I mean that, and they don't. You can't. And then there's another Star Trek movie that is based entirely on, the precipitating incident involves a supernova that threatens to destroy the entire galaxy. And no, they can't. It doesn't. That's not how any of this works. It bothers me, but I can just laugh at that because, I mean, Star Trek claims to be based in science, but it just clearly isn't. And you know, it's
But
about characters. I like the
yes,
characters.
exactly.
But then you have something like The Martian, which is both a book and a movie. And it's great. I really like The Martian.
Mhm.
I don't read stuff I don't like. So I end up in the position of using books I like as examples of what not to do. So, no, read The Martian. It's a great book. But
Yeah.
Good. Yes, will
it
do.
starts with a dust storm threatening to blow over a rocket on Mars, and you can't do that. The atmosphere is too thin. The wind on Mars isn't strong enough to blow over anything because the atmosphere is too thin. So if I want to read a book about what it's like on Mars, The Martian won't do that. And that makes me sad because it's a well-written book, and I would like to read a book about what it's like on Mars, written by that author, because he's good. And
Mm,
he went and he put that stupid dust storm in it, and now it's not that book anymore. And that
mm,
just makes me sad.
mm.
So that's where I go with it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm also a huge Star Trek fan, but I suppose Star Trek is about something else entirely, not the
Yeah.
science. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
it's about, yeah, it's about human interaction, and it's about culture, and they stick it in a scientific framework.
Yeah.
And I guess the thing about Star Trek is look at how many things are in the original series. So this is in the 60s, right? In 60 through 1963.
Hmm.
And take some of the things they have there and say, oh my gosh, we have that now. You carry a communicator with you. There are handheld body scanners available. Um, there's all kinds of stuff that they do in that series that is science fiction then, particularly, only now somebody somewhere has gone, whoa, that's a really cool idea. Let's, make an iPad, let's make a smartphone, let's, do whatever. I mean, I did have a flip phone at one point in time, but
Mm,
I think, again, maybe we can't separate science fiction from science theory that becomes science fact and go from there. I mean, look at the things H.G. Wells wrote about, and a lot of that is totally possible.
mm,
Fusion rockets are going to get us to Mars. So Caroline can go and see how Mars is because she can go there herself and visit the planet. But Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, he's a NASA scientist essentially. He's a rocket scientist, and there are dust storms on Mars. And the way I would have done it is I would have had the dust storm because they last for like 6 months at a time before they dissipate, and pile up a whole bunch of sand on one side of the rocket and have a shadow on the other side and have it push the weight of the sand pushes the rocket over. So there you are. It isn't instantaneous, but it can happen. There are other ways to explain it scientifically, but
Exactly, and that's what makes it so sad. I mean, he totally knew better. He made a deliberate decision to take leave of reality because he thought it would make a better story, and it was totally unnecessary. He could have done exactly what you just said, or, oh no, we need to leave before the dust gets here because it will, you know, gum up our equipment, or, we won't be able to use our solar panels or whatever.
right.
They could he had options and he didn't take.
but do you keep on reading, although the science is not 100% correct or completely correct? Or does it annoy you so much that you would put the book away, despite the plot and the characters?
Well, I read pretty compulsively, so I'm going to finish the book. There are very few
Mm.
books I've ever started that I didn't finish. I'm going to read it and I'm going to enjoy parts of it and then I'm going to complain about it.
Okay.
But it will distract me.
Yeah.
That's what I think
Mhm.
about as a writer. Is this, if I cut a corner here, is that going to distract readers? Are they going to pay less attention to the important things in the book because they're sitting there thinking, now, is that really possible?
Mm,
Mhm.
I don't want my readers distracted.
mm. What about you, CA? Do you put the book away or do you keep reading?
Um, I would probably put it down. If it happens frequently in the book, I might put it down. If it happens once or twice, I'll carry on. Um,
Mhm.
it's sort of the thing about bad grammar, and I hate to say this because I'm not an English major. I don't have a degree in literature. I'm a scientist, and probably I have bad grammar in my books. But if a book is not, if there are misspelled words, if there are misspelled terms, um, that annoys me because now I'm going to read the book starting to look for more misspelled words, which is totally frustrating. And that's just because I'm, anal about it. But I do think that if it's bad enough, if it's a pretty gross infraction, I probably would put the book down and I'd write a review about it.
Now, since you mentioned spelling and grammar, you know what's coming, don't you?
I do.
You do. Because
I do.
are you one of those who insists on American English or not at all? Because that's where you get your one star reviews from in on Amazon if you write a book with British English spelling and grammar, and then you made a mistake. No, it's not a mistake. It's actually
It's
done
actually
well.
correct.
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually correct. And again, I'm not necessarily going to spell color with a U or honor with a U, but there are rules about, and I find it a lot in websites too, or in a form that I'm filling out, that they've misused a word. So affect or effect.
Mm-hmm.
One's a noun and one's a verb.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, now you know the extent of my English grammar understanding. But yeah, those are things that make me crazy. So
Yeah.
luckily, I have someone who will read it and go, no, Loose is not Lose, and you need to change that. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah. So no matter at all. Like I said, color or when you use different vocab, for example, lorry instead of truck or something like that.
well, and it's interesting because in my Paris Contagion, I didn't use the word wrench, which is a tool, a hand
Mhm,
tool.
mhm,
I used the word spanner
hmm,
because in the Navy, they use spanner, they don't use wrench. And so those are kind of things that I would prefer to use British English because I happen to think the Queen's English is correct. No
not at
negative to King Charles, but yeah, the Queen's English is correct. That's where our English came from, and we bastardized it. But I doubt it would get past my publisher. So there you go, or they'd question it. Um,
Or as Hercule Poirot put it, the Americans are very backward people.
yes, I would agree with that. Yep.
Not me, just
No,
quoting.
well, and then so we've talked about science experience. I think it's world and life experience that's so important for an author. And that, I know people who live, granted, Colorado is a big state, and we have counties that are the size of Connecticut, which is another state that's fairly large. But I can have a county in Colorado that's the size of Connecticut who has people who live in it who have never been out of the county. Okay. I don't know that they can write about European things if you've never been out of the county. I think there's some basis in your writing that has to come from who you are, what your life experiences are, what your interests are, and go from there. And maybe it's like a duh to some people listening, but um, I feel that there are authors who, I would rather have an author take me to a German village and set the book in the German village because they know about it. They they've been in that German village, than I would try to have them take that village and stick it in New England and say, okay, now I'm going to write about this, and they can't get it right. Okay, that's how I feel about science too.
Hmm, okay. And in both of your opinions, do we need more science in fiction or just sci-fi?
Yeah, I think we have a good amount of sci-fi already. I mean, I like sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, sci-fi is science fiction is fiction about science. It kind of looks at science from the outside, and a lot of it's really fun, and it's in sociologically important, so on and so forth. So we have a good amount of it. We could have more. That would be nice. That would be fine, but we don't. We don't need more. Science-based fiction doesn't look at science, although I mean you can have scientist characters, so forth. It uses science to look. And yes, we need more of it. I mean, people spend day after day consuming entertainment in which reality is just optional. You know, and so no wonder they go to vote, say. and they're still thinking that reality is optional. You know, climate change is real. We can't just decide it isn't real because we don't like somebody's policy proposal relative to what to do about it. It's like, okay, you don't like that proposal? Fine, propose something else, but it's real. You know, you've got all of the science denial stuff.
Mm.
How are people supposed to take science seriously when the entertainment that they spend most of their lives parked in front of doesn't?
Mm.
And and when people just sort of assume that science is uncool, it's going back to that football thing.
Mm.
Like, oh, you can't have your book too sciency because nobody will like it. Well, I'll like it. I'm somebody. I'm not nobody.
Yeah.
We need to treat science as important as a culture, or what's happening will continue to happen. So, yeah,
Mm.
we need more science in fiction, definitely.
Mm. Mm. Okay. CA?
If we could get, however, we can get kids today um, to be exposed to more science. And if they're reading fantasy, if they're reading science fiction and fantasy, if they're reading hard science fiction, great, because they're not getting it in school, at least in the United States. And I 100% agree with Caroline. You can't be an educated voter making critical decisions. Every vote you make today is about science
Mm-hmm.
or is going to be
Hmm.
impacted by science. I don't care if you're voting for, dog catcher. It's still about science. What are you going to
Mm-hmm.
do with the dogs after you catch them, okay? Or how are you going to manage the shelters or whatever? It's still based in science. So you can't divorce yourself from science in voting or in just being an ethical human being and looking
Hmm.
at the things around you, and are you recycling, and are you doing this, and are you doing that, and so if we can get more kids to read about science in whatever format, then yeah, go. That's where I am. And if reading about Arthurian legend or reading about Tolkien's elves are good, then that gets them to read something else in science, in fantasy, and that drags them into science fiction, then great. I think that's critically important. And don't tell me AI isn't reading science fiction right now, because it is. And it can read the entire internet. And science fiction is out there, and science is out there, and it's critically important. So,
Mm. So I suppose uh, the next question is redundant because the question would be, will you ever not include science in your fiction?
I don't know how I take the science out of the scientist who happens to write fiction. I can't.
Mm.
Am I going to write a romance novel? Well, okay, maybe. But would there be a geologist in it? Probably. Or an archaeologist, or yeah, I'm sorry, there's going to be, I don't know how I do that. I don't, that doesn't, I can't do that.
Mm. Caroline?
I have written stories in which, like, you might think there's no science in there. you know, I, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't in my head when I was writing. you know, I mean, again, science isn't. It's not technobabble. It's not cool tech. It's not all that stuff. It's just what's real, what's not, and how do we know? And I'm not likely to write a romance for other reasons. That's not really my thing. But yeah, I mean, I have written short stories in which science is less obvious, and I'll probably do that again. But I mean, I'm interested in science. Science is the world. you
That's
know,
exactly right.
Yeah. You
why
can't.
would I write a
Bravo.
book that I'm not interested in?
Yeah, yeah.
I
Like
wouldn't.
they said you can't take the science out of the scientist.
Right. I mean, you can't. And if if we get right down to it, if you read a romance story, it's about social science. I mean, essentially, it's about humans in relationships and interactions with each other, and it's about social science. And social sciences are as critically important as physical sciences,
Yep.
as environmental sciences. I mean, it's still science.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. One last question from the teacup. When you write a book where the science is not part of your expertise, can you get lost in the research or do you limit yourself? Who would like to go first?
Well, that, I mean, yeah, there has to be a certain amount, a certain limit, or the book's never going to get written. And that's true whether it's right up my alley or not. You have to reach a point where, okay, uh, it it's time to launch this thing. It's time to go. Um, and that's true whether it's something I'm already familiar with or not, because no matter how familiar I am with something, I can always research it further, you know?
Yeah. What about
I,
you,
I,
CA?
well, I mean, anyone can get trapped down the Google rabbit hole, I guess. I mean, but I think so before I wrote The Paris Contagion, I spent about a year researching things. I'm not a virologist. I haven't been in the military, so now I'm totally dissing my own book, right? But I think to make it plausible and to make it believable, there's a certain amount of reality that has to go into it. So, yeah, I researched that book for about a year after I got the idea, having read The Code Breakers and Ebola. There had been an Ebola scare that made it to New York, and so those kind of the little pieces were falling in place. But yeah, I think research is important, but at some point for me, I know it's time, and the book writes itself at that point. I mean, because I know I have my stack of hard copy research that I printed off the internet or from wherever I've gotten it, and then if I need to look something back up, it's right there for me to look it up. So we're good to go.
Yeah, but here again comes the question or the hard decision for you to make as a writer. How much shall I put in of my research? Again, it's always the question for people who write historic fiction, for example. How much of my research, of my knowledge shall I put in to the book without it getting too much?
Just write the
As
damn
little as
book.
possible.
Okay.
Just write the damn book and then see where it goes. I mean, and I know there are some authors who outlined it to the point that the outline writes itself into the book, but write the book and then see where it is. And then have a good beta reader, have somebody who's not your editor, not your publisher, not your factoid person. Read the book and say, gee, I need to know more about Vienna in, the 1800s to, say, is this carriage correct or not? How many horses pulled this carriage? I'm into those kind of things because it's like painting the scene. I want to be able to see it, smell it, and taste it. Okay. And if there's not enough in historical fiction, if there's not enough factoids in there, I don't know, you know,
Mm.
where does it go from here, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
and how much do you need to explain? Because, like you said, okay, put in how many horses are drawing the carriage, but there are things, for example, when we talk about history, not about the hard science. Okay, history is hard science, but anyway, if you put in, for example, places also, and for you, or in this case for me, it's absolutely clear what it is, but not for my reader.
Hmm.
But how do you explain that? And how much do you explain? I mean, for example, Claire Ashton said, I mean, she didn't explain the DNHS. If you don't know what DNHS is, look it up.
Mhm.
For example, or in Fractures and Hinges, we had this building in the park, the Lusthaus, and
Mhm.
it doesn't have anything to do with lust. It wasn't
Mhm.
a brothel. Just saying.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and how do you explain that? That's not what you think it is, maybe, when you read the words.
Mhm.
It was a kind
But
of.
there's some latitude for the reader to build their own framework,
Mm,
and that's why I guess I don't think about that. Maybe that's wrong, and that's maybe why my books would be better if I did think about it. But
no.
I I just think that with science, it's there. It has to be explained. Maybe you think twice about how you're going to explain it, who's going to explain it. Somebody in the book has to explain it.
Mm,
Um, and is the point the science, or is the point where you're taking the science to make it science fiction?
mhm, mm,
The science is an avenue to science fiction to
mhm,
get you out there to say, I can travel faster than the speed of light. And here's how I'm going to do it.
mhm. Okay. Caroline, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is something I think about a lot, actually. My process, uh, I take copious notes. I do a Tolkien-like level of world building, and you know, maps and floor plans, and if I might invent a language, and uh, all of this stuff. And most of it never ends up in the book directly. But uh, that's the way narrative nonfiction works. If I were going to write a nonfiction account of, say, walking down the street in Keene, New Hampshire, I wouldn't, I wouldn't list the number and species of trees that I pass when I'm going down the street. This just, at least I probably wouldn't. It just wouldn't be necessary. You include the details that you need to do what you're trying to do, whatever that is, and you don't include
Right.
anything else. I'm a big
Right.
fan of the idea of, if something doesn't need to be in the book, it shouldn't be in the book because then it's in the way. But I need to know, because yeah, I'm walking down the street in Keene, New Hampshire, and I want you to know what it's like to walk down the street in Keene, New Hampshire. And so when I need a detail, I need that detail to be available. So,
Mhm,
for example, I can say
Right.
that I dropped a coin on the ground, so I went and picked it up, and I picked it up off of the sidewalk, and on the sidewalk walk was a stain from the leaf of a silver maple. Because there
Mhm.
actually was, like, like those kinds of details are important.
mhm,
And one way to get those details, and the way I get those details, is by knowing how many trees of what species are along the side of the road, so that when my character drops a coin and goes to pick them up, I know what's there, and then I can decide what to include.
mhm,
But I only include what's needed, nothing
mhm,
extra. If I can, that's the ideal anyway.
mhm, mhm.
Well,
Yep.
or what your characters need. I was 2/3 of the way through a quantum singularity and went, oh, wait, I've got to have a way for 3 ships to communicate across intragalactic space. Okay. Not easy to do. And I'm like, okay, how can I do this? Because you can't send a signal, it degrades over time and space and distance and all that. And so I was 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the book and went, oh, and I had to go back to the beginning and add in a way for them to communicate,
Mm,
having luckily just read something about quantum uncertainty and all of the stuff they're now doing with, and I'm going to forget the name and have a senior moment, so I apologize for that. But I think that, that's what I ended up having to do. I had to go back to the beginning and stick in a scene that allowed the characters to say, oh, wait, how are we going to send the ships off in 3 different directions when we know we have to have almost instantaneous communication? So the point that the characters got to in the book drove me to go back and to add something in. And it's about the need of the characters. The characters needed communication, so I had to stick it in a scientific way that made sense.
And before we ask the audience to ask their questions, may I ask, Caroline, what's next from you? What can we look forward to?
The next book to be published will be the sequel to Ecological Memory. And, same characters, same world, more expanded. There are more characters. You get to see the same events from multiple angles. It's not a single story. It's a short novel, a couple of novellas, couple of short stories, and they all interact, they share characters and that sort of thing. I've also started writing another book, which it'll be my first foray into high fantasy, although, it's heavily science-based high fantasy, and I'm basing fictional characters off of real people, and I'm going to do all sorts of fun things. I mean, there's going to be one scene in which an elf based on, and I'm not going to explain who these historical people are, it would take too long. Do look them up if you don't know. There will be at least one scene in which a character who is, by the way, a half elf and is based on William Tecumseh Sherman has a conversation with a woman who is based closely on Grace O'Malley, except she's black. So that's kind of what I'm going to be up to next. And it makes me very happy.
Okay. CA, you touched a little bit upon it before we started the broadcast.
So, 2 things. One, Quantum Time, which is the first book of the second trilogy in the Nexus series. So and for you and a couple other people who are like, when am I going to get the next one? There are actually going to be 3 trilogies and a prequel in the series. And so I'm the first book in the second trilogy. So that's going along really well. And except my characters are stuck because they're going someplace dark, and I'm not a dark person. So, but we'll get them unstuck, and Lauren and Alex will carry on with their role. I am working on Designer Genes, which will be the next book in the next political thriller, and again based in real-time events that are happening now, with world leaders and how they interact, and how you don't want to leave your DNA in places you don't want to leave your DNA. And then still I have a couple more or one more audiobook to do with Hillary Huber to finish out the audiobooks in the first trilogy. And Hillary's the bomb. And when you think about authors writing books for themselves, I do the audiobooks because I want to hear the book read by Hillary. That's what I don't care if I sell one or not. It's just like I want to hear Hillary read my book because she's so incredibly awesome. So, but that's sort of what's on the plate.
And may I ask the next one in the Contagion series? even though it's not called Contagion series. Will it be the setup? Will it be similar to the first book? Because we said when we wrote when we read it, it could easily be on stage. It's Chain of
I
the
think
Soul.
it could, yeah, it could be a movie. There's enough plot and character development in it to be a
Mhm,
movie.
mhm,
Designer Jeans is going to be similar. I mean, it's going to
mhm,
timeline wise, it's going to start sort of where the Paris Contagion ended and go forward, and again be a sort of, Tom Clancy meets Michael Crichton kind of thing. Um, but based in reality, based on just
mhm,
stuff that you can
mhm.
hopefully, Jill is actually convinced that, the North Koreans are going to jump out of a black car and grab me and take me away because they've read the Paris Contagion and they don't want to be dissed, right?
Mm,
Um, but this is going to be, some of the characters will come forward,
mhm,
um, because we didn't find bodies and that good kind of thing in the first book. So, yeah, but
mhm.
designer jeans. And not Jeans, but Gene. So go design your own jeans in that manner. So
Of course.
yeah.
And over to our audience. There is an audience. I know that there is an audience because I can see it. Dear listeners, people who watch our broadcast, I'm quite certain that you have questions for my lovely guests. And we've got 1 thumbs up and 2 hearts already. And like I said, quite a few comments on Facebook. And Terry also says, as a writer, I try not to put something in that will take the reader out of the story. Yeah, I do
Yep.
understand it. Yeah, because it
Yep.
has to flow. The story
Hmm.
has to flow and makes it also easier for the reader to follow the plot. Okay, definitely want to understand at least the basics as a reader. She also says, I hate to have to stop and look something up because the author didn't tell me what I needed to know, science, history, whatever. True, but if you do, sometimes I do look up, and I personally I'm not annoyed by it because I like to learn new things. And if I don't understand something, I look it up. To be honest, why not? Doesn't break a leg. No questions for our guests. Oh, come on. People, you do have questions. I'm quite sure I haven't asked all the important questions about science in fiction. It's not science in fashion. We know that.
But we're working on that.
Well, not so much lately, but it's on my to-do list, to be honest. No questions for my guests. Come on, everybody. You're all happy? You're all happy
Maybe if
campers?
I dance, I'll have questions.
Yeah, maybe. If not, no questions. They are still busy typing, maybe. I don't know. Would you like to add something, ladies, which I haven't asked? Is there anything you would like the people out there to know? Did I miss something? Did I not ask something which is important?
I don't know if that you didn't ask something that isn't important. I think the questions were outstanding. But I would do a little bit of self promotion here, and that
Yeah,
is
go on.
zip over to my website and subscribe to my monthly science newsletter. I do try to put out one every month, and it has historical foundations in science. It has book of the month. It has the word of the month. Um, and then it has just little science blurbs about here are the latest and greatest things. And I try to do it by theme. It could be geology, big earthquakes that we've had. A lot of times it's science and current events. So jump over there and subscribe, and you will be on my mailing list. So
Okay. Okay, Caroline, is there anything else you would like to add?
Uh, some self promotion.
there you go.
Yeah. Um, I am the only Caroline Ailanthus in the world. Like I Googled myself and I'm the only living person with my last name. So that makes me really easy to find, any search engine you like. It makes my books really easy to find. It makes my blogs really easy to find. Um, so yeah, I know my name has a whole bunch of syllables, but it's not actually that hard to spell. The only tricky part's the I, just so yeah, I do have a blog on my own work, and that was just on the screen for a moment. That's where
Mhm.
that is. And I'm on Facebook, I'm on Threads. Uh, yeah, come look me up. Read my books.
Absolutely. You should read both their books.
Yes.
Both guests
Read
have
her
written,
books too.
yes, have written wonderful books, wonderful stories, wonderful characters and plots. So, ladies, thank you so much. I will join you shortly in the green room. And it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so
Yeah, this
much,
was fun.
Edith.
Mhm. Dear listeners, what a pleasure to have those wonderful guests on. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you would like to support us, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. And we do hope we'll meet again on our channel, be it as an audio only podcast or maybe at another live event. Until next time.